I'll talk about the game I met when I was young. Hello, my name is Joe, this is Same Name Different Game, and I'm talking about a game that I have wanted to talk about on this show for literally years. And thanks to an Extra Life donor, it's finally happening. Now I got a lot of games to talk about this time around, so we are going to dive right in with a little history about Capcom's early arcade days and Super Joe Gibson. I have mentioned in the past that Capcom really likes to tie their games together, and the first instance of this was with Joseph Gibson, aka Super Joe. Super Joe was the hero of one of Capcom's earliest successes, Commando. Shortly thereafter, if the Capcom 30th Anniversary Character Encyclopedia is to be believed, it was Capcom's US branch that made the heretofore nameless hero of the Speed Rumbler into Super Joe. Then, a little game called Top Secret was released in Japan, featuring a hero with an extending arm. It was also Capcom's American branch that retitled this game to Bionic Commando and made another nameless hero into Super Joe in order to tie it in with the previous success of Commando. We'll obviously be talking more about that in a bit, but Super Joe's journey doesn't end there. After the arcade Bionic Commando, he was made a hostage in the NES installment, this time in all regions. And in 1990, Commando got a proper sequel, again in all territories, with Mercs, revealing for the first time Super Joe's full name, Joseph Gibson, who acts as one of the 3 playable characters. There is more to Joe Gibson's story, but it is all Bionic Commando related, so we'll come back around on that. Now, I want to talk about Takuro Fujiwara, who I know I've talked about before on this show, but I think it's high time he got an entire segment all to himself. Takuro Fujiwara is absolutely, positively a man who does not get his due from the gaming world, partially because he exited the industry about 10 years ago due to health issues, and partially because a lot of his most famous work was done in an era when the identities of individual Japanese game designers was not as widely known. But rest assured, you have played this man's games. You have played a lot of games that his work influenced. In the 80s, Nintendo had Shigeru Miyamoto, Sega had Yu Suzuki, and Capcom had Takuro Fujiwara. Fujiwara was the lead designer, usually credited as director or planner in Capcom games of this vintage, starting with the very first Capcom arcade video game, Vulgus, then creating a slew of well-known games, Ghosts and Goblins, Commando, and of course, Bionic Commando. He eventually moved into more of a producer role and head of the home division, where he managed projects while continuing to direct his own. He had a hand in games like Mega Man 2, Gargoyle's Quest, DuckTales, and Sweet Home, which would later find a kind of second life as the inspiration for the final game he produced in his first tenure at Capcom, a little game we in the West know as Resident Evil. After leaving Capcom, he formed his own company, Whoopee Camp, where he made both Tomba games on the PS1. But eventually, he did return to Capcom and made Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins, before leaving again. His final game was Platinum's Frank Miller-inspired Wii Gorefest, Mad World. It was in 1987 that Fujiwara's Bionic Commando, known in Japan as Top Secret, was released into arcades. And that is our first game for this episode, represented here on the Capcom Classics Collection Volume 1 for the PS2. Bionic Commando in the arcade is what a lot of games of this vintage are, a quarter muncher. To be honest, I don't actually like this game very much. It's far too difficult and in all the wrong ways, making it much more frustrating to me than something like Ghosts and Goblins. Your rate of fire is very slow. Power-ups to your shot don't seem to do much, you die in one hit, and flying enemies are the dirt worst, since it is extremely difficult to even get a beat on them. Add to all of this that the game is also super short, allowing you to credit feed through it in about 15 minutes or so, and yeah, it's not a winner. But what's important is that there's a germ of a great idea here. If you are not aware, the big hook for Bionic Commando is that there is no jump button. The player cannot jump. At all. There are some obstacles that automatically catapult you into the air, but you, as Super Joe in this iteration, cannot jump on your own power. You must use the eponymous bionic arm to latch onto platforms and haul yourself up. In theory, this sounds kinda terrible. Then, well, honestly, in the arcade game it kinda is. There are two big problems with the execution here. First, the arm fires straight ahead by default. You have to hold on an angle to make it shoot on an angle. Second, and more annoyingly, you cannot do consecutive swings. Once you fire your arm, that's it until you touch the ground again. Still, it's an interesting choice, which Fujiwara explained in a 2003 interview with Japanese magazine Continue.
If the players had been allowed to jump, they would have grown too dependent on it. You asked me why I didn't put in the ability to jump, but the game would have been ruined if I had. So, I did my best without it. I was pretty proud of it.
And he was right to be proud of it. It is truly an inspired choice, even if the arcade version doesn't stick the landing. No pun intended. No, that's not true. The pun was very intended. Anyways, there was a handful of ports of the arcade game to various microcomputers of the day, but as we've discussed many times on this show, I don't really know anything about those, and there's already a fair few games to cover this episode as it is, so maybe another day on those computer versions. For now, we are moving directly to the version I assume people watching this show are most familiar with, the NES version. And I don't say port because, well, this isn't a port. Released a year after the arcade game in Japan and North America, it's a sequel. In the Japanese version, this was very obvious because it had a different title. Hitler's Resurrection, Top Secret. But the US version kept the same title as the prior entry, simply Bionic Commando. But make no mistake, it is a sequel, seeing arcade protagonist Super Joe captured behind enemy lines, and the hero we now know as Captain Nathan Rad Spencer donning his own bionic arm to rescue Joe, hero of the Federation. Captain Nathan Rad Spencer here is not given a name in this game at all, just referred to in the game's opening and ending flashbacks as the person I met when I was young. Speaking of the opening flashback, yes, I did say that in Japan the game was called Hitler's Resurrection. Now, I'm not going to do a full-blown regional differences rundown here because largely there isn't much to discuss besides a small handful of graphical elements like in the comms room, a few enemies moved around, and oh yeah, the bad guys in the Japanese version are Nazis. I mean, yes, they're also Nazis in the US version, technically, but they're not ever called Nazis. They're called the Bads, with two Ds. And Hitler, who, spoilers, actually does get resurrected at the end, is called Master D in the international version. But make no mistake about it, when you play this game, you are taking part in one of the classic American pastimes, doing one thing and one thing only: killing Nazis. Like I said before, the arcade game has a good idea that it never successfully builds on, but with arcade director Fujiwara producing this home version, Capcom got it. They just got it. It might seem odd for me to say that one of the best 2D action platformers of all time is a game where the player cannot jump, but I am saying it. This game rules. And we have to thank, Hat-chan. Yeah, the credited director on this game, as was common at the time, was given a pseudonym, and all we know about this person is that they worked on this and Sweet Home, which made me think it might be Fujiwara himself, but Fujiwara had other pseudonyms and we know what they are. No one seems to know who Hat-chan is, but whoever you are, Hat-chan, kudos. At any rate, the game immediately improves on the arcade's two biggest problems. Now, by default, the A button fires the bionic arm at a 45-degree angle, making it much easier to hook on and swing. And second, you can, and in fact must, do consecutive swings without touching the ground. This mechanic is where the game truly shines, not only in how great it feels to use that technique, especially as you get better with it, but in how Capcom uses it to perfectly nail the difficulty curve. In the early stages, you can swing without much fear of pitfalls or death traps. Not that they're totally absent, but they're relatively rare, and where they do exist, you have a flat and continuous ceiling to swing on right above them. But as the stages move on, with a total of 12 action stages here, more than doubling the original arcade's 5, plus neutral zones, which we'll get to later, you must master consecutive swings. Starting around Area 6, you'll be presented with sequences of these lights. You can't stand on them because you slip off, so you must keep moving. And eventually, you'll be swinging on small columns to avoid spikes, effortlessly moving from one side of the stage to the other, and feeling like a superhero in a way that very few games of this era manage. The game also adds some fairly common home game concessions for the time. For starters, enemies now drop bullets, which are not ammo, but function as experience points. Get enough of them, and your life bar extends by 1. Now, unfortunately, you do start with no life bar, dying on just a single hit like the arcade game, so I tend to grind in the first stage just a little to be better prepared. But if you lose all your lives, not to worry too much, because you can get continues. You encounter enemy convoys on the map, and when you do, in a nod to the original Commando, you'll do a quick overhead run and gun stage where larger enemies drop eagle icons for continues. You can only have 9 at once, but they're easy to farm should you need more. Wrapping up the home game additions are neutral zones. Dotted across the map, these areas are occupied by both Federation and Bad soldiers, and even generals, including Generalissimo Kilt at one point. He's the leader of the Bads and the architect of Master D's resurrection. But you cannot attack your enemies, and they mostly will not attack you. But they can be home to both valuable information and items you'll need to progress, including radios, flares, and even Super Joe's machine gun. Now, while I absolutely love this game and count it among my top NES titles, it's not perfect. It has a few flaws. To begin, the radios are annoying. You need to find comms rooms in each stage to communicate with your allies, and maybe get some intel by wiretapping your enemies. This will also get the boss door to open. To operate the comms, you need to use a certain color radio, but you don't know which one. Sometimes other characters will tell you, but sometimes you're in the dark, and if you take the wrong one in, you have to hold A, B, and start to be extracted from the current area, change your communicator, and then re-enter from the beginning. Speaking of access to the boss rooms, my biggest complaint is the bosses. With the exception of the final boss, the Nazi super weapon known as Albatross, they're not very interesting. There are 4 variations of enemies that will attempt to stop you from blowing up each area's power core. Platoons of normal dudes, shield guys, robot guys, and drones. They're all very easy, and in fact, they can all just be ignored while you destroy the core, which will instantly end the stage anyways. Finally, the game does not have any save or password feature, and that's why, despite owning a legit card of it, I decided to play it on my EverDrive. Save states. But these are largely little things, and the way the game flows more than makes up for these small quibbles. Most stages aren't very big, but they are meticulously designed. And while Spencer gets more weapons and health alongside you becoming more skilled with the bionic arm, the final areas are just a joy to play. Plus, you get to blow Hitler's head off at the end in what is almost certainly the goriest scene in any licensed NES game. And before we move on, I must mention the fantastic music by Junko Tamiya. Capcom's music of this era is almost always on point, and Tamiya took an arcade soundtrack of just 2 songs and expanded it amazingly. In a 2014 interview with VGM Online, she said of this soundtrack,
"The composers of the 2 arcade songs asked me to still create the songs as I wanted to. I relied on the differences in the storyline between the NES version and the arcade version to give the NES music some of its character."
And she did. She nailed it. And speaking of nailing it, let's move on to our next game, Bionic Commando for the Game Boy. Going in, I knew this game was competent, but I'd never played that much of it. I did not expect it to be not only very good, but capable of standing alongside the NES game. I mean, obviously I've covered enough Game Boy games from Capcom to know that they didn't tend to phone it in, but coming 4 years after the NES game in 1992, at the hands of well-known Capcom Game Boy partners in crime Minakuchi Engineering, this game has easily become now not only one of my favorite NES games, but one of my favorite games on the Game Boy as well. This one is basically a remake of the NES title. The main story is the same. A group of fascists, now called the Do-Rise Empire, are attempting to build a super weapon called Albatross. Super Joe is sent in and kidnapped behind enemy lines, and Rad Spencer must save him, then team up with him to stop the bad guys. Except now, everything has a sci-fi anime aesthetic. I mean, just look at Spencer's hair. While it follows the broad strokes, a few of the stages are quite different. We all know that Capcom and Minakuchi were generally good about redrawing stages to fit the Game Boy's smaller resolution, but here we have completely new stage designs alongside remixed ones. And those redesigned ones add even more high-level grappling challenges, making stuff like dropping off your wire and reattaching before hitting the floor necessary to master, which, yeah, it can make the game harder in spots, but it becomes even more satisfying to hit the tough endgame swinging challenges. Contrasting this, some aspects are easier. You start with 3 units of health, making the early going way easier. You can also change equipment in comms rooms, which not only makes for a huge quality of life improvement on the radio problem from the NES game, but also allows you to change your weapons to suit your needs in different parts of a level. Minakuchi's version also manages to add some more interesting boss encounters. While some are the same, the enemies now have a rival for Spencer, General Ryle, who you face a couple of times, growing stronger with each iteration. And while you don't get to blow Hitler's head off, you do get an entirely new final stage. See, in this version, the Albatross isn't just a boss, a tank with jets. It's a flying battleship that Spencer and Joe must board to take out from the sky, presenting the stiffest swinging challenges yet alongside a huge new final boss. There isn't a ton in the way of other changes, though the enemy encounters on the map are now just standard side-scrolling affairs instead of overhead shoot-'em-ups, but they still serve as a place to get your continues. Also, continues aren't quite as important here because being a portable game, they decided to add a password system, allowing you to pick up right where you left off with all your gear at any time. Oh, and the secret passages you can reveal in 2 spots on the map no longer hold permanent gear for Spencer. Stuff like the helmet item is found in them on the NES game. Ultimately, Bionic Commando on the Game Boy is an excellent action title that fans of the series and the hardware cannot afford to miss. It's right up there alongside Minakuchi's other Game Boy masterpiece, Mega Man 5. Now after this, the Bionic Commando name lay dormant, at least as far as Capcom was concerned. While Nintendo actually published a spin-off on the Game Boy Color, it wasn't until 2008 that the house the Blue Bomber built would come back to Bionic Commando with Rearmed. Now, look, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one because it doesn't have the same name, but it merits a mention, both so I don't get yelled at about it, and because it's one of the best game remakes of all time, alongside stuff like Super Mario All-Stars, Double Dragon Advance, and the Resident Evil 1 and 2 remakes. And no, I'm not kidding. Bionic Commando Rearmed for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC is a remake of the NES game that takes a couple cues from the Game Boy version, including the comm situation being way less frustrating, and making the Albatross an entire stage unto itself. Although, on that note, if you get this game today, I advise not downloading the 1.01 patch, because it kind of screws up the balance in the final stage. At any rate, this game was released to tie into our final game for this episode, and ended up being much more of a critical and commercial success than that game. With genuinely humorous dialogue, added features including being able to use the bionic arm to grab and throw barrels, character art by legendary game artist Shinkiro, and an amazing soundtrack by Simon Viklund that remixes Junko Tamiya's already fantastic work on the NES, this game is exactly what fans like myself wanted from a remake. It even adds completely new and original boss fights. Do not sleep on this game. It's still listed on all platforms, including Steam, where it's regularly on sale. Sadly, it is not playable on Xbox One, but if you still have your 360 or PS3, grab it. And that brings us to our final game for this episode, Bionic Commando on the PlayStation 3, also available on the 360 and the PC, basically all identical. It's a sequel. And I don't want to go all chronologically confused angry video game nerd on you or anything, but can we please stop calling sequels to things the same thing as the original thing? We now have 3 entries in a series of games that make up one continuous narrative, and all 3 of them are called Bionic Commando. Anyways, Bionic Commando 2009 was published by Capcom and developed by Swedish developer Grin, who was also behind Rearmed, but something very clearly went very pear-shaped on this one because, frankly, this game is awful. Now, sadly, in the last couple of years, I had a hard drive failure on my PS3, so I lost all of my save games, and due to that, you're getting a lot of stuff from the first hour because honestly, I just can't bring myself to play that much more of this game. I hated it in 2009, and I still hate it. During the 6th and 7th generation of consoles, video games, particularly big budget ones, got very obsessed with being realistic. This didn't mean the game conceits had to be realistic, of course. This is still a guy with a robot arm swinging around killing an army by himself, but everything got very serious. Things had to be retroactively explained if they were dumb in old video games, despite old video games largely being dumb. And Rearmed had just winked at the audience constantly, but the full-price game had to be straight-laced about everything. So instead of Nazis in hot pink uniforms, we get an earth-tone cityscape, Spencer swearing a lot, and one of the dumbest twists in video game history, which is saying quite a bit. Also, I'm using the retro skin for Captain Spencer. By default, he looks like this. This game also goes the extra step to fully bring Mercs into it, with a cameo by one of the other playable characters from that 1990 arcade game, which, yeah, I guess that's a fun Easter egg, but it also feels really weird. That isn't the end of the world. A good game that takes itself too seriously is still a good game. This one has a bigger problem. It's not fun to play, owing mostly to the swinging mechanics feeling bad. Really bad. The game tells you that you can just hold L2 in the air and you'll hook onto the next thing, but the problem is that your wire has a surprisingly short range, so you just end up flopping down to the ground a lot. Add to that, huge swaths of the map are covered with radioactivity that kills you very quickly, and you have a city that you want to swing around in, but you can't. I mean, you just want to go nuts like in, I don't know, say, Spider-Man? But there's radiation that's bad for your bionics, Spencer, so take this tunnel instead, or walk through this building instead, these places where there's no room to effectively use your arm, which is the whole conceit of the game. The combat is just fine. The guns don't feel great, but I guess they don't feel awful either. And the basic enemies aren't bullet sponges or anything, but if you didn't already think Treyarch Spider-Man games from the PS2 generation were better at the time, playing it now, you will definitely think Insomniac's Spider-Man game is better. This game came at a time when Keiji Inafune was one of the very higher-ups at Capcom and talked a lot about Western games, or games that appealed to a Western audience. But when a Japanese publisher gets an American producer to work with a Swedish studio to make a game that feels like it was meant to appeal more to Gears of War fans than Bionic Commando fans, well, you can see what happens. And then, even someone as cool as Mike Patton from Faith No More and Mr. Bungle providing the voice of your hero cannot make the game worth playing.
Don't get reckless. The enemy might be on you.
I don't know how it was that the same team made Rearmed and then went on to make BC09, because, yeah, the difference is truly night and day. But I will say this, 10 years later, I feel like the Capcom of today, the one putting out stuff like Resident Evil 7, the Resident Evil 2 remake, Mega Man 11, they could do something fun and interesting with Bionic Commando. But let's not dwell on that. Let's do like we always do, take a look and a listen side by side. The arcade game looks fine for its vintage, but The NES and Game Boy versions really excel for their respective hardware. The PS3 game is technically fine looking, but as I mentioned earlier, I despise the very earth-tony aesthetic. As for music, once again, the NES and Game Boy put out the best of the bunch on this one. And that makes it time to give the edge. And honestly, it's a bit of a toss-up between the NES and Game Boy versions, and I did not expect that. But yeah, they're both really good. I guess I would say the NES version gets the slight edge, because 1, you get to blow Hitler's head off, and 2, the ending sequences aren't quite as frustrating, but still, if you've played one of these and not the other one, you have got to check out the one you haven't played yet. The arcade version is weird, because while I thought it was on the Capcom arcade cabinet pack from M2, I was remembering wrong, and the only official release of it on a home system is on the Capcom Classics pack. But that's fine, honestly. The Xbox and PS2 versions of that compilation are about $15 in the current aftermarket. The NES cartridge generally goes for less than $15 as well, and BC09 on the 360 or PS3 is less than 10, but you kind of get what you pay for with that one. And yeah, well, Game Boy version could be a sticking point, what with an actual cartridge going for somewhere around the $30 range these days, but that is mitigated by the fact that if you own a 3DS, it's on the eShop for just $4. That does it for me, but make sure to come back soon, because I am already gearing up for the Halloween season. See you then. Hey everyone, it's Joe. Thank you so much for watching. If you dig the shows, please do all this stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell gimmick. I don't know, whatever, the algorithm demands tribute. But if you really dig the shows, consider supporting on Patreon. Just $1 per video gets you early access to new episodes, your name here among all these lovely people, and it keeps the channel ad-free. If you want more Capcom, the Capcom Chronology playlist is on the right, and if you want more Game Boy, the Game Boys of Summer playlist is on the left.